Bienvenue à tous.
Welcome
to the 5th edition of the Paris Peace Forum. I recognize that using the word peace comes with a heavy sense of reckoning during these times. As a people, we have been confronted by many realities, a pandemic to which we lost far too many lives, that exposed all the cracks in our global system, further exasperation of inequality because of the many people we left behind due to the disparity in vaccine distribution, the reality of the climate crisis, the food crisis that many vulnerable communities are facing every single day, this war and the violation of a country's sovereignty, women and children having to leave behind their family, having to leave behind their beloved country to seek refuge elsewhere. Their horrific reality weighed with another heavy truth, that not everyone fleeing conflict and seeking refuge is treated with the same sense of solidarity. These times call for us to confront how we treat crisis depending on the geography, depending on the classifications we make based on global south and global north issues. So where does hope come from? From doubling down on multilateralism, common values of protecting human rights, from debating and reaching consensus on how we can together strengthen civil society, international cooperation, and our shared common values. So thank you for showing up today with a sense of urgency and willingness to participate in the mission of the Paris Peace Forum, where we bring together all stakeholders, such as yourselves, that have the potential to promote good global governance, to debate on nuanced issues, from universalism to governance of AI, and reach common commitments. Hope comes from our project leaders, who we have amongst us, whom I hope you will get to know over the course of the next 2 days, that are showcasing their brilliant solutions that's having a real impact in the lives of communities locally, regionally, and internationally. And on that note of hope and a sense of urgency that we have shown up here with today, I want to welcome our first speaker, Her Majesty Rania Al Abdullah, Queen of Jordan.
Bonjour. It's an honor to join you at this Paris Peace Forum. I suspect that even if this is your first time in Paris, you had no trouble getting here this morning. The modern technology we carry in our pockets has made it almost impossible to get lost. We could be in any city in any country in the world and still know exactly where to go. But we're gathered today because it often feels our world itself has lost its way. Everywhere we turn, we're confronted with complex crises that demand collective action. Yet too often, we are failing to meet our common threats with a spirit of common cause. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. When COVID made it risky to breathe the same air, it was literally hard to stand together. The war in Ukraine has sent shockwaves across the geopolitical terrain. Inequality is driving disillusionment and enabling extreme voices to break through. The forces of outrage and misinformation are crowding out compassion and common sense. Too often, so-called facts are no longer self-evident or connected to any evidence at all. We've seen an alarming erosion of public trust, trust in government, trust in the media, trust in each other. So, the theme of our gathering has it right. We are facing a convergence of crises. But I want to challenge us all to aim higher than just riding out the storm. Our world is off balance. Simply trying to keep things steady is not enough. We should treat this moment like the shake-up it is. It's time for a paradigm shift, and that will take 4 critical realignments. Renewing our faith in truth, recognizing that we all have equal worth, safeguarding the future, and believing in our ability to remake the world as we wish it could be, as we know it can be. Let's start with truth. We must tell it like it is and act on what we say. Honesty is the foundation of trust, but words are not enough. Cynicism flourishes in the gap between words and deeds. Take, for example, the climate crisis and the chasm between promises and policies. We have shown we can set ambitious goals, but what's the point if we don't follow through? 7 years ago, right here in Paris, world leaders pledged collective action to limit greenhouse emissions and prevent global temperatures from rising. And yet, as the UN Secretary General declared last month, we are falling pitifully short of those commitments. Earlier this week, President Macron warned that the climate emergency is here. The most recent UN climate report estimates that temperatures will rise a full degree past safe conditions, and that we have no credible path to meeting our stated goals. What is our excuse for further delay? Is it selfishness, denial, an expectation that if we wait, someone else will fix the problem for us? The planet is burning and melting and flooding before our eyes. It's too late for wish lists. We need binding to-do lists to save both our credibility and our planet. With so much at stake, I am reminded of something Victor Hugo once said. Great perils have this beauty, that they bring to light the fraternity of strangers. Which brings me to the second piece of our paradigm shift. We must honor our common humanity. We all live in the same world. Self-sufficiency is an illusion. None of us can truly thrive unless we all do. Yet, during dark times, there can be an impulse to only look out for our own, to say of others, if they are not like us, then we do not like them. But until we embrace the reality of our connectedness, we'll continue to bear the worst of its consequences. Consider, for example, the global refugee crisis, which has reached epic proportions. More than 100 million people are displaced around the world, 1.5 times the population of France. We all know it is hard to balance domestic needs with global cries for help. But the international community has more capacity than is sometimes claimed. Take the world's response toward the more than 7.6 million refugees who have fled Ukraine since February. Like everyone, I've been deeply moved by the images from Europe and everywhere else, as host countries welcomed exhausted, frightened families to their new homes. And yet, how different the response has been toward refugees from places like Syria, Myanmar, and South Sudan. Those people too had been driven from their homes. They too were frightened for their lives. What accounts for the contrast in compassion? Does skin color make all the difference? Too often, the barrier isn't budgets, it's bigotry and bias. With such a flawed moral compass, it is no wonder our world feels as though it's lost its way. And as long as our response to challenge is raising walls instead of will, we will be condemned to strife and suffering without end. So our paradigm shift must include recognition that all of us have equal worth. But it's not enough to recognize the humanity of people living in faraway places. We must equally value those who will live in an entirely different moment in time. And that leads to part 3 of the paradigm shift. We have to act in the service of future generations. Because what we do today is about tomorrow, too. Our choices will affect people we will never meet, but who matter as much as we do. We see a glimpse of their faces in our children and grandchildren. Last year, in a global survey of 10,000 young adults, more than half thought the things they value most will be destroyed. 40% said they'd hesitate to have children of their own. 3 out of 4 said the future is frightening. Is that the way we want young people to feel? That it's all downhill from here? we who still hold the social, economic, and political levers of power have simply got to do better. Our power isn't a right, it's a trust. Our job is to be good stewards of our time. What matters is not the next election, or the next financial quarter, or the next generation of smartphones. What matters is doing right by the next generation of humanity. Because the truth is, despite all the doomsday predictions, humanity is just getting started. To understand what I mean, consider this thought experiment from philosopher Toby Ord. As he points out, the typical lifetime of a mammal species is 1 million years. Can you guess how old that makes us? From an ecological point of view, humanity is still in our teens. We still have so much left to do, so many possibilities ahead. And we've never had greater tools, greater knowledge, or greater ability to achieve the impossible. Which is why the last piece of our paradigm shift must be renewing hope and confidence in ourselves. Despite all our shortfalls, we do have every reason to. With each new day, we read of advances and breakthroughs that sound like miracles. Images that capture the dawn of the universe, a new malaria vaccine, a laser-powered chip that can transmit the entire internet nearly twice per second. And despite the multi-crises we face, humanity has made enormous progress. In the past few years, 1 billion people have risen out of extreme poverty. Infant mortality has fallen by more than half. More children go to school and fewer go hungry. 2 billion more people have access to safe drinking water, more than ever before in human history. Even on climate, for all the work that remains, let's not lose sight of accomplishment. In just 5 years, we have reduced expected warming by nearly half. It's not just technology that's enabled these wins. It's collaboration and trust, the instinct to help, the goodness that resides in human hearts. I think of families in places everywhere who've opened their homes to newcomers in need. The global scientific community working together to create a life-saving vaccine in record time. Entire neighborhoods singing together from their balconies, making music during the worst of the pandemic. And this conference itself, with all of you coming together to share insight and encouragement. The engine of hope remains our ability to imagine something new, something different, to believe that things can be better than they are, and then act to make it so. And just as important, to resist complacency and try to imagine things sooner so that we can fix problems before they become perils and prevent tomorrow's crises before they start. 55 years ago, in a very different time and place, Dr. Martin Luther King gave a speech in which he described the invisible book of life that faithfully records our vigilance or our neglect. He warned that there is such a thing as too late, and he stressed the fierce urgency of now. I know every one of you feels this urgency and also sees the possibility that lies ahead. Whether strangers or old friends, we share common faith. Faith in truth, in one another, in our future, and in ourselves. Let these be our guideposts as we chart a worthy path forward. Let us prove we are not too lost, we are not too late. Every moment, we have an opportunity to get it right. Let us meet our moment together. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Your Majesty Rania Abdullah, Queen of Jordan, for unapologetically challenging the deficit of courage that we are seeing today as a person of color, for also highlighting that the difference in the way we treat refugees is not barriers, but bigotry and bias, and critically for saying that power is not a right, but trust. So thank you for that, really. continuing with the sense of hope, which requires action, not just promises, I want to welcome our next speaker, President Gustavo Petro. Your Excellency.
Señora Reina de Jordania, Su Majestad Rania al-Yassin, Presidente del Foro de Paz de París,
Your
Pascal Lamy,
Majesty, the Queen of Jordan,
Secretario General de la Organización para la Cooperación y el Desarrollo Económico de la
President of the
OCDE,
Paris
Matías
Peace Forum,
Corman, excelentísimos jefes de Estado
Secretary
presentes en
General
este
of the
foro,
OECD,
distinguidos Nobel de Paz que nos
heads of
acompañan,
state and
representantes
government,
de las organizaciones internacionales,
laureates
empresas,
of the
bancos de
Nobel Peace
desarrollo,
Prize
fundaciones y
present here
ONGs de todas las
today,
regiones del mundo,
international
ponentes
companies,
que participan en
development
esta
banks,
quinta edición
representatives
del foro
from countries
de
all over
paz,
the world,
medios
dear
de
speakers who
comunicación
are here
presentes y en
today
general
to
a
take
toda
the
la
floor
ciudadanía que aquí nos acompaña.
at this Forum for Peace and to all the
Si uno
citizens
mira
who are
las
with us
guerras del siglo
today.
XX, tratando de hacer un paneo
If we
global
look
y general
at
con lo que significa
wars
falsedades que
that
traen las
occurred over the century,
generalizaciones,
and
la
if we
pérdida de
try
complejidad,
to take
uno
a
podría
general
resumir
view of
que
the situation,
el
avoiding
siglo XX presenció unas
generalizations and
guerras
oversimplifications that
que
prevent us from
se
seeing the
construían
complexity of the
alrededor o
situation at
estallaban
hand.
alrededor o
Well,
del
we can
concepto de la
see
riqueza
that
o
wars
de la distribución de la riqueza.
occurred around the
Sean
idea
las guerras de
of the
liberación nacional de
distribution of
muchos
wealth.
de nuestros pueblos
Now, be
en
it
el tercer
wars of
mundo,
independence,
sean
for many
las
of
guerras
our
agresivas
peoples
que
in the
desató el
Third
fascismo y los
World,
nazis,
albeit
sea
wars of
lo que
aggression
llamamos la Guerra Fría y que duró medio
perpetrated
siglo
by fascists and
hasta acabar
Nazis,
casi con el siglo,
or be it the Cold War,
todas
which lasted more
en
than
el
half a
fondo tenían
century,
que ver con el
and that
problema de la
nearly
distribución de la riqueza y el
annihilated
concepto
our
mismo de la
century, in
riqueza.
fact. All of these wars had
Eso ha
the issue
cambiado en el
of
siglo
wealth
XX.
and its distribution at their core.
Y de
But
manera
this changed in the
sustancial
21st century.
hay una diferencia entre los conflictos
And I
armados
would say that it changed
que nos
radically.
separan de este siglo con
There's a
los del siglo
difference
pasado
between the
y por tanto
armed
un tratamiento
conflict
diferente en la
of
salida
last
política
century versus
dialogada
that of
o
the current
pacífica a
century.
esos conflictos.
The solutions to these
Quizás en este
conflicts are
siglo
also
podríamos ver
different. They're now
dos
based on
estilos, dos
dialogue and
fuentes
finding
de la
a
confrontación
peaceful
entre los seres
way
humanos
out.
de tipo armado.
I would say
Una
that
tiene que ver con
there are
algo que
two
voy a llamar
ways
las
of
guerras
thinking about
fósiles.
these
En lo que
conflicts.
llevamos del siglo,
The first
han estallado
type of
diferentes
war is the
conflictos
fossil
armados bajo
war.
la forma de
From the
invasión
beginning of the century,
que
we've seen a
tienen que
number
ver
of
con el
armed
petróleo,
conflicts.
que tienen que ver con el gas,
A territory
que tienen
was
que ver en
invaded
general con los
for its
hidrocarburos.
oil or gas,
Irak,
or fossil fuels in
Siria,
general.
Libia,
Iraq, Syria, Libya.
nos muestran, y yo diría y lo extendería a la actual guerra en Europa, Ucrania y Rusia,
And that
nos llevan a una
demonstrates,
especie de estertor,
and
a una
I
especie
would
de
also like to mention,
decadencia
of course,
de la
the
economía
current
fósil
war
en
of
la
aggression
Como economía
that
fósil,
Russia is
concibo,
waging in Ukraine.
como su nombre lo
This
indica,
shows
la
us
economía fundamental del mundo
how
que
these
usa como
conflicts
energía
are
y como
linked
materia prima
to the
fundamental
fossil fuel
lo que nos está
economy as
matando a
the
través de su
basic
transformación, el
economy
consumo intensivo del
and
petróleo,
system
del
that is
carbón y del gas,
fundamentally
que es la fuente
killing
real
us,
de la
in
crisis
fact.
climática.
The excess consumption of oil and gas that is at the very heart of the current climate
La vitalidad
crisis.
del pensamiento, de concentrarnos en
Now,
las prioridades del principal problema de la humanidad, como
instead
que
of
la crisis
focusing
climática tiene
on
el potencial de
the
destruir
priority
toda
for
la vida
humanity,
en el
which should
planeta y
be
la especie
the climate
humana,
crisis.
y no por los
The climate
efectos
crisis, which could very
hollywoodescos
well
de las grandes
destroy
catástrofes que se pueden
life,
pasar
human
por
life
el
in
cine y la
particular,
televisión,
and not
sino incluso por lo
only
invisible cuando se van
because of the
rompiendo a
very
través del
cinematic
cambio planetario de los
aspect that
ciclos
the
del
climate
agua,
crisis
los
bears,
ciclos mismos de la
but
vida,
also because it
las
shows us that when a
cadenas
system breaks, for example,
infinitesimales de la
the
vida,
water cycle, when it is
allá en lo
disrupted,
invisible
all
aparece el
forms of
monstruo,
life
lo que nos puede extinguir, los virus,
and the
las
entire
bacterias que cambian de
chains
comportamiento,
on which life
la
relies
posibilidad de que
can
especies
also
enteras,
collapse.
a
And that
través
is when
apenas de algunas
viruses
semanas,
and
meses o
threats that
pocos
can
años
destroy us come
desaparezcan.
about. They can
Si es así
destroy
con las
an
especies
entire
vegetales,
species
si es así con las
in
especies
very, very little
animales,
time.
¿por qué no con los
Entire
animales?
species of plants or
La
animals
ciencia lo ha dicho.
or even human
Y sin
beings
embargo,
could
ese
disappear.
tiempo vital que aún
Science
tenemos
tells us
para hacer las transformaciones
that the
profundas
time we
que la crisis
have to
climática
undertake a
demanda
deep
a las
transformation
sociedades, a
of
la
our
política, al
systems
poder,
and
al
respond
sistema
effectively to the
económico,
climate
no solamente
crisis.
local, sino global.
That solution needs to come
Una
from
demanda de
society, from
transformaciones que, si se quiere,
politicians,
tendrían
not
que ser
only at a
radicales.
global level, but also
Ese
at a
tiempo
local
de la
level.
transformación
These transformations need
se
to be
oculta,
radical,
se pierde, se gasta a
and
partir de una especie de
we
política del
have no
avestruz,
idea
nada
that the
pacífica.
time that we have to
Una
undertake those
política del
transformations
negacionismo que tiene que
is
ver,
not
en el
only
fondo,
hidden
con
but
que no se quiere cambiar el
wasted
poder,
because
con que
we
no
are
se
in
quiere cambiar la
denial.
sociedad, con que
Because we
no
do
se
not
quiere
wish to
cambiar un
change
sistema
power, we do
económico que ha
not wish to
construido
change society,
enormes
we do not wish to
intereses
change our economic
minoritarios dentro de la
system,
humanidad.
which has given rise
Solo hay que ver el diferencial de consumo
to
per cápita
vested interests,
de
minority
material
vested
fósil, y
interests.
por
And
tanto,
if
de
we
emisiones de CO2
look at
por persona,
per capita
si se compara
consumption,
el ciudadano
and
común
the
de los Estados Unidos con
correlation
el
between per
ciudadano
capita
común
consumption of fossil fuels
Colombia
and CO2
o de
emissions,
una nación de
and if we look
África
at
o
a
de
citizen in the US
Esa
or a
desigualdad en
citizen
emisiones
of Colombia or of an African
es la
country,
desigualdad
the
social del mundo.
difference is
ese poder,
astounding in terms of
ese tipo
per
de
capita CO2
sistema
emissions, and that
económico que
reflects
genera
inequalities
tal
that
clase
exist in
de
our world.
desigualdad, quiere
And it is that
permanecer.
very economic system that
Quiere vendernos la tesis
leads to
que la
inequality.
solución a la
And
crisis
that
climática
economic
es un
system
simple cambio
is entrenched.
tecnológico y cosmético,
The solution
con que
to the
solo se
climate
espicha una tecla y
crisis
podríamos cambiar
is
todo sin que cambie
presented
nada.
as a technological solution,
vieja
as
tesis
though
del
we
gato pardo.
could press a button and
pelusa.
everything would change.
Cambia todo, pero en el fondo no cambia nada. Pues en esa
It
degradación de la
is
política, en
like
esa
the Prince
degradación
of
del poder,
Lampedusa,
en
the
medio de
Gato
una
Pardo, who
crisis
used to say,
civilizatoria indudable,
everything needs
como
to
que
change
estamos viviendo el
for it all to
comienzo de
stay the
los
same.
tiempos de la
But
extinción, y nos tapamos los ojos,
looking at this
o más bien
crisis,
vamos con los ojos abiertos, pero al suicidio
it's very clear we
aparecen,
can no
como decía
longer
Antonio Gramsci,
turn
los
the other
monstruos.
way.
Los monstruos ya están
Because
aquí.
as Antonio Ranchi
Los monstruos
said,
son un tipo de
if we
conflicto
were to face the
que le voy a
crisis, we
llamar
would
las
see
guerras
monsters. But
Lo que
the
desató
monsters are
en este
already
siglo
with us.
las
These
invasiones,
demons are
y
what
todas son,
led
desde el
to the
punto de
fossil
vista
wars.
ético
And
y
in this
democrático,
century, that is what has
malas,
led to a
negativas,
number of invasions, which
perversas.
obviously are
No hay una
extremely
invasión
harmful and
buena,
perverse from the
una
point of view
invasión
of
mala.
democracy.
No hay una
There's no
postura
such thing as a
política que te
good
diga,
or a
"No,
bad
es que es
invasion.
correcto el que
There is no political
rechaces esta
standpoint
invasión, pero aplaudas
that
participa en
enables
esta
us
otra
to say
invasión".
that such and
Porque no
such
son más sino los
invasion is
determinantes del
positive
poder
while
mundial,
another
lo que
isn't.
guía una u otra
As
posición.
indeed, it is those who wield
negacionismo en
power
la
at the
práctica,
global
así
level
se tenga
who
un
make
discurso
one choice
sobre
or
la crisis
another,
climática, un
and it is
discurso en
them who
automático,
promote that denial
que
that
puedes
we're
combinar los
witnessing.
párrafos de manera diferente,
Our
que puedes
rhetoric
usar
on climate
en
change is
Sharm el Sheikh, sur del
practically
Sinaí, pero también
automatic.
en
You could
París.
shuffle up the
Lo
different
puedes usar en
paragraphs
Pekín, pero también en Nueva York,
that
y
you
dices lo
find in this
mismo y no
type of
dices
speech,
nada,
and then use the
porque
same
es
speech in Sharm
simplemente
el
una
Sheikh, in Paris, in
retórica de la
Beijing, in New
crisis
York. It's always the
climática.
same thing, and
En medio
ultimately
de
we
ese
say
negacionismo
nothing.
en la práctica,
And that is
vamos
the rhetoric
hacia las
of
guerras,
climate change.
vamos
So we have
hacia la barbarie.
denial that has led
Le he
to
nominado a esta
war
tendencia 1933.
and barbaric
Pero global.
behavior. And I've called
En
that
1933,
tendency
ascendió
1933.
al poder.
1933 at the global level, as of course it was in 1933
Hay
that
otro tipo de
Hitler took power
conflictos en el siglo
in
XXI,
Germany.
más
Now, there are
locales,
other
más
21st century
provinciales,
conflicts that are more
que no
localized
aparecen en la televisión,
or even
sino de vez en
provincial,
vez,
one could say, because
que les voy a
they're not
llamar
covered
los
in the media.
conflictos que ya no son por la distribución de
those
la riqueza o por
call,
un cambio
I mean,
del
I
concepto de la
describe
riqueza
as
como en el siglo
conflicts
XX,
that
sino que tienen que ver es con el
are not
control de
linked
unas
to the
riquezas,
distribution of
generalmente
wealth,
materias primas.
but
Las guerras
are
por el
rather
diamante,
linked to control
por las
over
esmeraldas
certain
en el
types of
caso de
wealth. For
Colombia,
example,
las guerras por el
diamond
opio,
wars or emerald
guerras
wars, as
por
in
la
Colombia,
cocaína,
opium
y en el
wars,
fondo
cocaine
también
wars,
las guerras por el control de los
and
pozos petroleros o carboneros en el mundo.
wars
Ese tipo de
for
conflictos ha generado
control
lo que el filósofo
over
Alain Badiou,
oil
aquí,
and
francés,
coal
no sé si
in the
parecido,
world. Alain Badiou, a French
nos enseñó
philosopher,
ahora,
I don't know whether
recientemente,
he's from
cómo
Paris,
la creación de los asesinos de
recently
masas,
uh,
grandes depredadores
recently,
en territorios que expulsan,
referred to
desplazan,
this phenomenon
torturan y masacran
as
poblaciones
a number
enteras
of
solo
mass
con un
murderers
objetivo,
who
quedarse con las riquezas
expelled
locales
entire
y a
populations
partir
from
de
their
ellas
territories
mantener a perpetuidad
with
la
one
generación de
single goal
ejércitos
in
armados
mind: gain control
privados,
over their resources
ejércitos armados
and
que pueden continuar
perpetually
guerras a
maintain
perpetuidad.
private armies in
Tenemos
place so
esos
that
dos tipos
they
de
may
conflictos,
continue the
las
fight
guerras fósiles
endlessly.
y las
There are two
guerras por
types
el
of
control
conflict:
de la
the
riqueza.
fossil wars and wars
Si
for control
quiero
over
aterrizar
wealth and
a mi
resources.
país desde esta perspectiva, a mi región,
And
donde
in
está
my
Colombia
country,
y
and in
Venezuela,
my
en una de
region,
la esquina de América del
that is
Sur,
to say, you have
entre el
Colombia and
Pacífico y el
Venezuela in
Atlántico,
one
muy
part
bien
of South
situada.
America, between the Pacific
Uno mira el
and the
planeta de
Atlantic.
determinada manera, podría decir con la relatividad de los puntos
In an
geográficos,
ideal
en el
location, one
centro
might
del
say.
mundo. Y sin esa
And
misma
one might even
relatividad,
say that
la
it is the
gran
center of the
capital de la
world.
biodiversidad del
And
mundo,
if we
países bellos,
were to continue along
hermosos,
these lines,
porque
these
por
are
circunstancias geológicas,
biodiversity
del azar, de la
capitals of the
creación del
world,
planeta,
beautiful
terminaron
countries,
concentrando
and for
la mayor
geological
parte de las
reasons,
especies vivas, naturales y animales
a
del planeta
large
Tierra,
number of
una
animal
explosión
and plant
de
species
biodiversidad,
are concentrated in this
una
region.
explosión de
It
vida,
was an absolute
concentrada
explosion
en
of
unos pocos
biodiversity
kilómetros
and an
cuadrados.
explosion of
Si yo
life,
voy
really
hacia ese
concentrated
rincón,
on
encuentro
these,
las mayores reservas de
these
carbón,
few square kilometers.
muchas en
And
el
that
mundo,
is
y las
where
mayores
the
reservas de
largest
petróleo,
coal
entre
reserves
varias en el
in the
mundo.
world are found,
Petróleo y carbón
and
debajo de la
also
tierra.
the largest oil
Y en
reserves,
medio de esa
or among the
diversidad
largest oil
natural que
reserves in
está
the world,
en
under the
cuestión,
ground,
que
of course.
está
And
en
amidst all
destrucción
of this natural
precisamente por lo que hay
diversity,
en el subsuelo, pero no por culpa de lo que hay en el subsuelo,
this
sino
natural
porque
diversity that
la
risks being
maquinaria
destroyed
económica
because
desatada
of
desde la
what lies
revolución
under the
industrial,
ground.
una manera de organización de la
Because,
humanidad alrededor de la
And
producción,
because the economic machinery
específica,
that came about during
el
the Industrial
capital,
Revolution and that has been
movido
organized
por el
around
ansia de
production
acumulación, por el ansia de la ganancia,
and leads
en
to
tiempos bíblicos se podría
capital
decir por la
driven by a
codicia,
desire for
ve en
accumulation.
ese subsuelo la fuente de la riqueza,
And if we were to go back
y
to the
no ve en
Bible,
ese suelo de
it's really
explosión de
driven
la
by
vida
greed,
ningún tipo de riqueza,
and there's
sino
this,
algo
and there's a
desechable y
tendency to
combustible.
see the
Bueno,
underground
en
as
ese rincón
a source
tenemos
of
guerra.
wealth and not as a source of life.
Y nuestra
And
responsabilidad
that
como jefes de
is a part of
Estado
the world
allí,
where
como
these wars
líderes
occur.
políticos,
And as
como
heads of state
lideresas, como
in the
sociedad
region,
en
as
general,
political
es
leaders,
tratar de aplacar esta
as
guerra.
societies, our role
Y me he
is
preguntado a
to
lo largo de
try
estas últimas décadas
and
de mi lucha
appease
política,
those wars.
incluso ha
And
pasado por
in
las armas,
recent decades, during my
si la
political struggle,
posibilidad de
in
la
which I
paz en
also
esa
took up
región del
arms,
mundo,
I
de casi 100
wondered
millones de
whether
habitantes, no tiene que pasar no
whether
solo por las
achieving
decisiones
peace in that
internas,
region of the
sino por
world
el mundo.
that has a population of 5 million people,
Por ejemplo, Venezuela.
wouldn't peace also require
Bloqueada.
decisions taken at the international level?
La
For instance,
presión sobre Venezuela,
Venezuela
que sufre de
is
una
in a
polarización
very
política
difficult
y de
situation.
una
It is under
inestabilidad
a lot of
democrática
pressure.
indudable, tiene que ver con el
And
petróleo que está en el
we
subsuelo.
see that all
Es
of
que
this
allí hay
pressure has a
muchísimo
close
petróleo.
relationship with
Y
oil
por tanto, esta
in the
tendencia
country, as indeed
del
Venezuela
avestruz
has
del
large oil
negacionismo a
reserves.
controlar la riqueza en términos de
So
energías
this
fósiles
policy of the
lleva ya
ostrich, this
intereses
negationism,
que si
the
son los
desire to control
rusos,
fossil
que si es
fuels,
la OTAN,
is
como
all
si
spurred
Venezuela
by
pudiera ser también
stakes,
una
interests on the
posible
part of Russia, or whether it be NATO,
y vecino, mi
as
país,
though
con
Venezuela could
centenares
perhaps
de
become another
kilómetros de frontera
Ukraine.
común, con
And as a
flujos
matter of fact, my
migratorios que
country
antes que la
shares
humanidad
several
conociera,
hundred
o por lo
kilometers
menos los
of
países
common
ricos
border with
conocieran de
Venezuela,
ellos,
and it has
ya había
undergone a great deal
observado
of
en las últimas
migratory
décadas
flows well before
millones de
wealthy
colombianos que
countries
fluían hacia
experienced such
Venezuela
migratory
cuando los
flows.
precios del
My
petróleo
country,
eran altos
Venezuela,
y
saw
nosotros
millions of
pobres.
Colombians
O al revés,
come to Venezuela and
millones de venezolanos que
come to
fluían
Colombia when
hacia Colombia, y no sin
the rising
xenofobia,
oil
no
prices,
sin
or the opposite,
aparición del
millions of
odio del
Venezuelans
uno contra el otro, bastante contenido. Nosotros nos
received
dimos cuenta
Colombians,
desde hace décadas
and there
que
was no
venezolanos
xenophobia or
y
hatred of
somos el mismo
one
pueblo.
another. Why? Well,
Si millones
because
pasaron a un
decades
lado y
ago we
millones
understood that
pasaron al
Venezuela and
otro,
Colombia are
nuestros hijos son
a single
comunes.
people.
Nuestra sangre
And
es
if there are
común.
migrants, millions
Y
of
no nos
migrants
avergüenza,
on both sides of the borders, because we have the
porque
same
no
blood.
hemos caído de todas
We're
maneras
one and the same,
en esa
and why should we be
ficción
ashamed
del
of
odio al
that?
extraño, del odio al extranjero,
Well,
del
precisely
odio al
because
inmigrante por
we
muy
did not
diferente que sea.
give into this fiction
En este
that we believe the
escenario de
other,
nuestra
the migrant,
esquina,
should be
Colombia vive
an
una
object
guerra
of hatred. In this
desde
respect,
hace décadas.
Colombia
Ha pasado
is
por las
still
fases de la
at
historia.
war for decades now.
Nació por allá en el siglo XIX, yo diría que nació en el
Colombia has
momento
undergone a number
en que
of
un
historical
imperio
periods. It was
europeo,
created
el
in
español,
19th century,
decidió
this
conquistar
country,
un
when
territorio que
the
desconocía absolutamente.
Spanish
La gran
Empire
explosión
had
de la vida,
decided
la potencia
to
mundial de la
conquer
vida,
a
donde hoy se
land
sitúa
it had no
Colombia.
knowledge of whatsoever, where there was a great
Guerra
deal of
perpetua que ha
living
matado
power, which is what we call today Colombia.
Centenares de miles de
A
colombianos y
perpetual war
colombianas que
which
sufren son los
led to the
pobres.
death of
Guerra
hundreds of millions of
perpetua
Colombian
que
men and
pasó
women,
a través
because
del siglo
ultimately who
XX
suffers?
en la Guerra
The
Fría, que
destitute.
se vistió de rojo, que
This
se
is a
vistió de
war
negro
that
también,
has
como en España,
that
y
happened
que
throughout the 20th
sobrevivió
century, became a
luego, en el siglo
Cold
XXI,
War, draped itself in red and black with
vistiéndose de los
Spain, and then in the
ropajes del control de la riqueza, del
21st
control de
century
la cocaína.
is
En uno
wearing the
y en
garments
otro país,
of
la
wealth
guerra
control
tiene un
through
acicate,
control over
tiene
cocaine
un fogonero
trafficking.
que está en el mundo.
So therefore, our
Para el
country
caso venezolano, que aún no sufre de
has
conflicto armado y espero que
found
nunca lo sufra,
a
el
new
control del
motive
petróleo,
to
la
go at
decadencia de la
war.
economía fósil,
In
la
our world,
imposibilidad
it
de
is
pensar
this
aún en
desire
una
to
economía
control
descarbonizada, porque en realidad esa palabra
the
oculta que una
drug
economía
trade.
descarbonizada
We are
implica
aspiring for
una
a carbon-free
transformación
economy,
real de la sociedad,
because a
de la economía,
carbon-free
de los
economy
intereses
involves a
que surgen de la
true
economía y
in-depth
del
transformation of society and of
en el
stakes
caso
that come
colombiano,
from the economy and
el acicate de
power.
fogonero
And in the case of
también
Colombia,
está en el mundo.
what
Ya
underpins
no
all
es
of
la
this?
dinámica
Well, it is to be
interna
found
de
in
la
our
sociedad
world.
colombiana autodestruyéndose, sino que es una prohibición
Today, there's no
normada
longer
y
this
dictaminada
self-destructive
desde organismos
momentum within
internacionales.
Colombian society, but a
Prohibir
prohibition
la hoja
that
de coca,
is
que no es
that
más
comes
un
from
vegetal,
international organizations and institutions because cocaine is just a plant that Europeans found that in transforming and processing this plant, you can produce cocaine, a drug which kills 3 million people per day in the United States. And those death figures are due to the mixtures of cocaine plants with a drug produced in the United States that kills 100,000 American citizens yearly. Cocaine actually started being the cause of war 50 years ago when Nixon declared war on marijuana. And today, marijuana has been legalized in most American states. Over 1 million Americans have died of it. And today, where in the world is there the greatest violence? Not in Iraq, in Libya, in the Middle East, or Ukraine, but in fact in the Americas. The greatest violence is found in the underground routes towards, which are the cocaine routes, that are leaving a great deal of bloody trails behind, with millions of dead people in Latin America. And we also see a great many prisoners in jail in the United States because they're caught in drug trafficking. Latin Americans, Black African Americans are victims of this problem at the time already of Pablo Escobar, who was the drug lord of an international mafia. But today, international mafia is no longer found in Colombia, and this mafia moves around billions of dollars worldwide through the international system and through money laundering. And who is a victim of this drug trafficking? The proletariat. And in Colombia, we see this problem. It is very much felt, and there are two problems in the world: the refusal of moving towards a carbon-free economy and weaning ourselves off of oil and gas, and also this money that could be used rather than to go at war to prevent drug trafficking and nicotine use. We need to ensure that we avoid war that leads to destruction and death, and we need to foster peace. Peace depends upon us. It is upon us, Colombians, to try and debate and have a dialogue to ensure that this specter of death be far removed from our territories, and that in our lands we can see life flourish again. We need to give humanity the ability to a carbon-free atmosphere by protecting the Amazon forest. This is also, of course, dependent upon the decisions taken by other international bodies, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and the COP party of Conference of the Parties, if it can be efficient, but it is less efficient. International parties should look squarely at the truth and spare us death, a certain death that is much more significant than that caused by the two world wars of the 20th century, because there are a great deal of perils and problems we don't see in the media, but that have an impact on millions of people consuming drugs, and it is this drug consumption scandal. There are also people who drink champagne or may smoke a cigarette. So there are, of course, other kinds of drugs that can be even worse. And such people sometimes should consult a psychologist, and we live in a society that protects them. Because when a society falls victim to addiction, this means these are the weakest chain in society, the weakest link, these people. If a person is left behind by society, it leads to addictions, drugs. And in society, when a given society is used to living a constant competition as if it were a horse race, and it showcases a lack of love. Now, when it comes to global decisions, we can see that we need to change our drug policies worldwide. We need to be brave. We need to determine how we can face these global powers and forces that push us to self-destruction, so that we can also push for carbon reduction, carbon-free economy, rather. This should not be solely a technological change, but it involves deep social, political changes as well. And for the same reasons, changes in people in power around the world, so that we can be able to live. In short, I would say that nowadays we are faced with an era which could ring the death knell of human life, and it's also could also be the end of humankind's fight for greed. We should put an end to power struggles that require more and more materialism. We need to cease accumulating wealth and develop a new notion of wealth, which is based on the intensity of life, of our life. This is a true radical shift in mindset. And what leads us to fossil fuel wars? Well, this fear of change, whether it is during this century or during other periods when there were other wars for because of the rush towards different types of resources. We need to avoid perpetual war and move towards a carbon-free society. And if we do not do it ourselves, it will be humanity which will come to an end. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, President. I'm sorry that we just had to rush you a little bit. And thank you critically for calling out the war on drugs. Drug policy reform has been a critical subject that Paris Peace Forum has been addressing for many years. With that, I now want to call on stage the Executive Director of the World Food Programme, David Beasley, to talk to us more about the food crisis.
Your Majesty, Mr. President, it's great to be on the stage with you, and a special thanks to President Macron for calling leaders around the world together in a time of crisis, multi-crisis all over the world. When I took this role 6 years ago, there were only 80 million people on the planet, as we would say, marching to starvation. That's a different discussion than chronic hunger. 200 years ago, when the world's population was 1.1 billion people, 95% of the people on planet Earth were in extreme poverty. Today, less than 10%. We have built systems and programs and institutions that's sharing more wealth than any time period in world history. But tell that to the 10% that we're not reaching. The answer is not destroying the systems that's helping the 90, but what are the solutions to continue to reach that 10%? who are struggling to get food, to have shelter, to have the medicines for their children, to have a way of life, to have hope. I thought that I would be able to put the World Food Program out of business. That was my goal, my objective. Unfortunately, we're going now backwards. We're moving in the wrong direction. The number of people went from 80 million people not knowing where their next meal is coming from to right before COVID to 135 million people. So you would ask the question, if you were a leader or a thinker at all, why did this happen? And the simple answer, man-made conflict, greed, corruption. Number two, you got it, climate shocks. Unprecedented. COVID comes along with economic devastation of the poorest of the poor nations around the planet. And just when you thought it was over, it recycled again and again, and creating debt to the poorest of the poor nations around the world as national safety net programs were created. And just when you think it could not get any worse, then you have Ethiopia war, and then Afghanistan, and then when you really think it can't get any worse, the breadbasket of the world, Ukraine, a nation that grows enough food to feed 400 million people, now has the longest bread lines of the world. And when you take enough food out of the market to feed 400 million people, what do you think is going to happen? In 2007 and 8, when we had the inflationary food crisis then, and Arab Spring in 2011, 48 nations had riots, civil unrest, protests. Today, the economic indicators are much, much worse, and the poorest of the poor have no coping capacity anymore. So why should you be surprised at the riots and civil unrest that's taking place around the world? But the nations of wealth, as I tell you, we've got solutions. We can stop the storm. I was just down in the Darien Gap. I just met with the president of Colombia, 4 weeks ago? Right, I think the day you were sworn in, I believe. I'll be going to Venezuela on next Saturday. People are losing hope when they don't have food or any degree of peace. They will do what any mother or father would do for their child. Germany just did a very simple study. They had 1 million refugees out of Syria because the European community was late in addressing the Syrian crisis. Just in Germany alone, 1 million refugees ended up in Germany, $125 billion at a cost of, just on the humanitarian side, $70 per day. The World Food Program, we can feed a Syrian in Syria for 50 cents a day. We feed 130 million people on any given day, week, or month. When you feed that many people, you know what's going on in the neighborhood. You know what they're thinking, because we survey them all the time. People do not want to leave home. But if they have no hope, they have no food, they have no future. The number of people in Central and South America that are migrating toward the northern border of the United States, the southern border in northern Mexico, it costs the United States to shelter a child $4,000 per week. For $1 to $2 per week, I can have the most successful resilience program where families can take care of themselves. Which do you think is a better option? The Black Sea Grain Initiative, creating crises around the world because of this war, is giving us some hope. I'm literally sitting here on the phone as we're trying to move the fertilizers and move the grains, trying to negotiate between the different parties. When the war broke out, and most of the leaders in the world were focused on the eastern front of the battlegrounds, I immediately went down to Odessa and said, Mr. Putin, if you want famine on the rest of the world, then keep this port shut. And I began messaging to leaders around the world that we have to maintain supply chains. We must move these grains and these fertilizers around the world. You see, there's a population now in the world, 8 billion people. 4 billion of them depend on fertilizer. And I have said this on every major talk show in almost every continent on the planet. I don't care if you love or hate Russia, but we've got to have the fertilizers out of that country. Russia and Ukraine, the region, produce 30% of the world's supply of wheat, 20% of the world's supply of corn, maize. I could go on and on. And as I have said to leaders around the world, you would think that with all the wealth, $430 trillion of wealth today, there would be no poor. You would think with all of this connected technology of smartphones that people would be loving each other more and connected in a good way, but we actually have more brokenness and loneliness than any time period in world history, it seems like. And as I tell the leaders, we're all consumed with the tweet of the day, the 24-hour news cycle. We're running around like little children. Remember that little game of whack-a-mole? You pop one and another one pops up, but we're not giving attention to solving one. As I'm asking the leaders, slow down. Let's solve some of these crises because the world is very, very fragile as we speak. I was in the Sahel just recently, in Somalia, and you think it can't get any worse, and you see the pricing of food going up, but imagine what it does in a poor country. I have mothers telling me, like in Afghanistan, in Syria right now, with the winter months that are coming, that Mr. Beasley, I don't have enough money to buy cooking oil and heating oil. I either have to buy cooking oil and therefore freeze my children, or I have to buy heating oil and therefore starve my children. I cannot do both. Shame on us when there's $430 trillion of wealth on planet Earth. Shame on us that we're not able to resolve some of the complex conflicts that we have today. 80% of our operations are in war zones. Imagine if we could calm the storm and put that money towards sustainable development for the poorest of the poor. And I'm asking leaders around the world, donors, when you provide funds for us, give us the maximum flexibility so we're not just providing food and creating dependency over and over and over again, because we have sustainable solutions. Last year, for the first time in modern history, there were more people displaced because of climate than because of conflict. Unprecedented, and it's only going to get worse. But we have solutions. While the world debates answers for mitigation, we have to have adaptation. Because, see, while the wealthiest nations on the planet are trying to make these solutions to reduce the carbon footprint, the poorest and the poor that are devastated are trying to survive day in and day out because of flash floods and droughts like in Somalia right now. 4 and 5 back-to-back rainy seasons didn't happen. 50 years worst drought in the history of Syria. In the Sahel, I could go on, Pakistan, and all around the world. But when we can come in a program like the Sahel and rehabilitate the land, let me just give you an idea of the heart and the mindset of the poorest of the poor around the world. They don't want handouts. They don't want to leave home. And they tell me, Mr. Beasley, we don't want your support, but we're trying to survive. And when our donors give us the flexibility to rehabilitate the land, guess who rehabilitates the land? It's our beneficiaries. And if you want to learn about the free entrepreneurial spirit, you don't have to necessarily go to Harvard. Go meet an African woman. Oh my gosh. Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Just in the past few years, our beneficiaries have rehabilitated 3.5 million acres of land, built over 81,000 kilometers of feeder roads, 26,000 kilometers of water canals, 380,000 community gardens, 107,000 small ponds and reservoirs to hold water so they can irrigate. And when we come in to these areas with a school meals program, oh my gosh, guess what happens? Migration drops off the chart. Teen pregnancy drops off the chart. Pregnancy and marriage by 12 and 13-year-olds drops off the chart. Recruitment by ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab drops off the chart. It's a lot cheaper to go in advance and do it right than to wait after the fact. That's the World Food Program. Our desire, our hope, is to put ourselves out of business. Mr. President, as you quoted with regards to the Bible, the resources we have are there to create wealth or are there to create life. One of the greatest teachings in the ancient scripture that transcends all world religions that comes from the Torah, love your neighbor as yourself. I had a Jewish rabbi correct me, said the actual ancient Hebrew translation of that is love your neighbor as your equal. Can you imagine if we loved our neighbor as our equal? It ends racism, discrimination, sexism. It ends conflict because we see each other as our equal. I was doing a major TV show in the United States called 60 Minutes. And we were finishing the story. It was a very compelling, heart-wrenching story on Yemen. And Scott Pelley, he said, Governor, you've got the greatest job on the planet, saving the lives of millions of people. I said, Scott, I do. I really do. But I'm going to tell you something that you haven't thought of, and this is going to bother you. And he looked at me like, what could that be? And I said, Scott, I don't go to bed at night thinking about the children we saved. I go to bed at night heartbroken over the children we could not save. And when we don't have the money that we need, we have to choose which children eat, which children don't eat, which children live, which children die. How would you like that job? We're now taking money and food from the hungry children to give to the starving children. We need your support to end the wars, to allow us to do what we need to do, because humanity is depending on us. I know it looks like the sun is setting, but it's not. If you get out there in the field with me and see those little children, in spite of all the military rubble and destruction, they're like flowers in the desert. They bring us hope. Let us not give up on our children. Thank you, and it's great to be here with you.
Thank you, Executive Director David Beasley, for that powerful intervention. I'm reminded of the words of Al Gore when he said that, yes, we're dealing with limited resources, especially when confronting the climate crisis, but that political will is a renewable resource. And I am grateful that you kept reiterating that your mission is for the World Food Program to go out of business and that you don't want to stay in a position of power. So with that, I now want to welcome the president of the Paris Peace Forum, Pascal Lamy, and the Director General and founder of the forum, Justin Weiss, on stage to tell us what we could expect today and tomorrow.
Well, as you've noted, we're running a bit late, so it'll be very short, both Justin and myself. First, to welcome you, of course, wholeheartedly. Second, to tell you what we are expecting from this 5th edition of the Paris Peace Forum. And I'll share with you my expectations. 3 expectations. 1, solutions. 2, solutions. 3, solutions. That's the business we're in. I won't dwell, and this has been formally done by Princess Rania, by President Petro, by David Beasley. We know we are facing a broken world. our endeavor since 5 years now, since 2018, has been to try and bridge a few of these broken places. We've done it successfully in a number of areas, not always. Some of what we tried didn't work. But what worked were protecting children on internet, was starting cleaning the lower orbit of the planet, surrounding Antarctica with marine protected areas, financing independent media in countries in need, and many of these other things which may look not that big, not a big treaty, not a big international organization, but steps forward. This time, again, we will be working, you will be working, we will be working together on new initiatives, some coming from you, and that's what you've seen, with all these projects which are displayed and supported by many people who are full of energy. You can feel it in entering into the basement room here in Palais Brongniart, but also on sort of more top-down initiatives, like, for instance, on critical materials, like, for instance, on finding new solutions for a better protection of cyberspace, and maybe on helping these two opposing parties in Venezuela who asked us to host a first in a dialogue that has so far not taken place and which both sides believe is necessary. That's, again, a solution-oriented. So, Justin, over to you.
Thank you, Pascal. We know that East and West are getting further away from one another. We know that North and South, that the gap is increasing as well. And so what we wanted to do from the start, from 2018, was to offer that event once a year to get them a bit closer in order to facilitate solutions to the problems we face. And that's what Pascal explained. So I very much hope that this 5th edition of the forum will enable us to do that, will do its part in a complicated world, and that it will, in the end, have impact, because that's what we've been striving for. Now, it's already 11:10, and we're running out of time, and I'm in charge of the schedule. So I'll stop here. I want to thank you all very much for coming. I want to thank the staff for organizing this. I want to thank Trisha and the whole team behind the forum, and I wish you a very good 5th edition of the Paris Peace Forum.
Thanks a lot.